Hello, Bethel family and friends. This is Kevin Diehl again. Haven't spoken to you for a couple weeks, but I'd like to share a midweek devotion with you by starting with a personal story. Several years ago, my family and we took a Eastern Caribbean cruise to the islands in the Eastern Caribbean, of course. Getting there was somewhat of an adventure. What happened was we were leaving Cape Canaveral, and the waves were choppy, and storms were out to sea, and we were sailing right to them. And as the waves got more intense and the storm got more intense, guess what happened? The engine went bad. Engine's propulsion broke, and we were basically floating aimlessly in the water. When we were going before that, before the engines broke down, we were cutting right through the waves, and there was really nothing to worry about. I mean, you felt a little rocking and rolling of the ship, but for the most part, you just went on doing everything. But once once the engine broke down, and we were just aimlessly floating, it was a little concerning, obviously, especially when you looked over the deck and you can see these 15, 25, 30-foot waves crashing into the hull of the ship. That was unnerving. And this kind of helps me in perspective to the story that I'm going to read, an event that happened in Jesus' life. And we find this story in Mark chapter 4, verses 35 to 41. This same event can be found also in Matthew and Luke. However, Mark seems to have a little more detail. That day, when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let's go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There was also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat, and so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." This story will find an emphasis on Jesus' humanity as well as his deity. We find in the beginning of this event that Jesus had been preaching all day long. The crowds were so large that he actually went out on a boat in the lake, which also is the Sea of Galilee. He preached from the boat to the people on the beach. Afterwards, and Mark says this, that same day, after preaching all day long, he said to the disciples, "Let's go to the other side." He didn't want to just go in and just go onto the beach and rest for the night. He wanted to continue to the other side. So the disciples went with him along with some other boats. And as this is happening, Jesus falls asleep. He was so tired, obviously, from from the day's preaching. And this marks the humanity of Jesus, that he's tired, and the disciples probably just felt, we'll just leave the master alone, let him sleep. And he was sleeping. Mark even says he's sleeping on a cushion in the stern, and that's where the captain of the ship would be. And what happens? A furious squall comes up. And this was not that rare for the Sea of Galilee because of its geography, with the mountains that surround it and the Mediterranean sea breeze coming from the south or the north. It just affected this area so much that these storms would come up out of nowhere. And we find, like I said, Jesus is sleeping. This squall was so intense that even the disciples, some of them who were fishermen, feared for their lives as the water was coming up over the sides of the boat, and they were afraid that they would sink. So what did they do? They might have been thinking of what Jonah did, or what the captain did in the story of Jonah from the Old Testament. He felt that he went down the captain of the ship went down to see Jonah because he was sleeping, and he woke Jonah, hoping that Jonah would plead to his God, and the storm would go away in that story. And maybe that's what the disciples were thinking at this point, that they would that just have to wake up Jesus, and he would plead to God that he had direct connections with God in order to maybe subside the storm. But whatever they felt, um, this is kind of like us as well. In the midst of storms, don't we call out to Jesus, asking him to help us? And in this case, they say, "Teacher, don't you care if we drowned?" Now Matthew basically says the same thing in his account of this story. He just says, though, the disciples said, don't you know we're going to save us from drowning?" But here, it looks like Mark takes it one step further and says, "Don't you care that we drowned?" So you kind of get that impression that they're a little upset with Jesus that he's actually sleeping here. But what happens? Jesus gets up, and this is the part of the deity of Jesus coming out. If any of us were sleeping, a really deep sleep, and we were awoken, I think it would take a while for us to figure out what's going on. But immediately Jesus knows what to do. He stands up and he speaks to the wind and to the seas. He rebukes them. And the first time that Jesus spoke to the sea and the wind was when he created both of them. And now he speaks and it tells them to calm down, have peace, and be still. And they do. They obey Jesus. It's just an amazing story here. And what's really interesting is that in Psalm 104, chapter 107, verses 28 to 31, listen to these words and see how similar it is to this event. The Psalm was written many, many centuries before this event in Jesus' life. Listen to what the psalmist says. "Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of the distress. He stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves of the sea were hushed. They were glad when it grew calm, and he guided them to their desired haven. Let them give thanks to the Lord for his unfailing love and for his wonderful deeds to men." Just an incredible story that we see here that was written in the Psalms as well as in Mark, and it was fulfilled in Jesus' time. It's incredible how that happens, and they may have been thinking about that as well. That psalm, when the disciples said, "Who is this?" Because the psalmist says that they spoke out to the Lord. They knew Jesus was a man. He was sleeping. They knew he was a good man and probably a prophet, because prior to this, he was healing people from a paralytic man, a demon-possessed person. And yet here he speaks to the wind and the waves, and they both obey him. So they're now thinking, "My goodness, who is this that is with us?" They don't obviously know what we know, that Jesus is fully human and fully God. They see the fully human part. Now they're starting to kind of grasp the fully God part. The other thing that I think strikes me is verse 36. And let me go back to that. We see them getting in the boat and taking Jesus with them. And then there's a sentence here that's not in any of the other scriptures or accounts from Matthew or Luke. It states here in verse 36 at the end, "There were also boats with him." So some of the crowd that was there on the beach hopped in the boats and went out with Jesus to the other side of the lake. And it just made me start to wonder, were they close enough to Jesus's boat to actually hear everything going on and hearing Jesus stilling the water and stilling the wind? Or was it later on, that once they got to the other side, that the disciples told them about that? We'll never know. All it says was Jesus rebukes his disciples, but we don't see what he does with the other people. But could you just imagine that conversation? Well, first of all, you're in another boat and you're just trying to find where the other boats are and trying to stay with them. And then all of a sudden, whew, everything's clear and it's calm and it's light out, or not light out, but it's at night, but it's still. And yet you say, when you get to the other side, what happened? All of a sudden that storm disappeared. And then the disciples said, well, we woke Jesus. He spoke to the sea and to the wind and calmed them. It's just amazing to be there, to see that happen. Jesus says to his disciples, where is your faith, basically, is what he's saying to them in verse 40. Why are you so afraid? Do you still not have faith? They don't understand who Jesus is yet. And we see that here. They see him as a man, like I said before. They don't see him as God. And that's where I think they're starting to figure this out a little. It's not until Peter later on says, we know you are the Christ. That comes later on. However, here, they might be starting to put some of it together, but they're not fully there yet. The other thing was interesting is the fact that Jesus used the boat as his pulpit when he was preaching to the people on the beach. That was his pulpit. That was his church. And as Jesus said to his disciples before, nothing will destroy my church. Nothing's going to destroy this boat that I'm on. Yes, I was sleeping. The man person of me was sleeping, but the God person of me was wide awake, knowing exactly what was going on, and nothing was going to happen to this boat with us on. So that just shows to us, the power that Jesus Christ has. And we see, go back to my original story from my personal time. So you know we're not left out in the sea there. The cruise continued. The crew members were able to fix their engine propulsion. The next day when we got up, we were in calmer seas, calmer oceans. So we were able to relax, and we made it to our destination. And in this story from Mark that we just read, Jesus makes it to his destination. In fact, when you look at chapter 5, you see the first thing Jesus does when he's on the other side of the Sea of Galilee is he heals a very, very strong demon-possessed man. So he's now going to overcome a man that other men couldn't overcome, had to be chained, broke the chains, and yet Jesus heals him by speaking to him as well. And we see that continuation. And that's the question I have to you is, are we allowing Jesus to lead us on a journey with him? No matter if storms arise, do we know he is always right with us in the boat? And in the case of the other boats, Jesus is near. He was always near. Not only is he in a boat, but he's in the position of the captain. And we saw that where he was sleeping. And the question to you too is, in your life's journey, do you allow Jesus to be your captain of your life? And do you trust Jesus through life's storms, no matter the duration of the storm? And in this case, the duration apparently wasn't that long. But some of our storms that we go through can last for several years. And some can be temporarily, some can be long. It depends on the will of God. And do we believe that Jesus has the power and authority over our storms, our problems? And the answer to that is yes, he does. Thank you, and have a good night.